Welcome, and thank you for joining today's web conference, Western Energy Imbalance Market Regional Issues Forum meeting. Please note that all audio lines are muted at this time until the Q&A portion of the call. We will provide you instructions on how to ask a question at that time. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Pam Sporborg, Chair of the Regional Forum. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Regional Issues Forum in Las Vegas. And we will start today's meeting with a roll call of the liaisons. This is Pam Sporborg with Portland General Electric, representing the transmission-owning utilities.
Darren Kester with Avangrid Renewables, representing the IPP sector.
Hi, Jennifer Gardner with Western Resource Advocates, and I'm representing public interest organizations and consumer advocates.
Matt Lockhart, California Transmission Owner Sector.
Therese Hampton, Neighboring Balancing Authority Area Sector.
Cameron Yurkowski with the IPP and Marketers Sector.
Suzanne Cooper, Bonneville Power Administration, Neighboring Balancing Authority Sector.
Clay MacArthur with Deseret Power, the publicly owned utility sector.
And do we have any liaisons who are on the phone? I also know that Tony Braun is on his way. His flight was slightly delayed on the tarmac, so he should be joining us shortly. With that, I believe we have a quorum, and we can agenda. I do want to recognize that I'm taking over the chair from Therese Hampton, and take a moment to recognize the excellent work that she has done in developing and expanding the role of the Regional Issues Forum over the last year, and recognize just how great it's been to take over this forum with her leadership, as well as recognizing the leadership of Cameron, and really built this forum from the ground up and really brought it together through a lot of hard work and efforts to solidify and consolidate this forum into the body it is today. And I appreciate that it's the forum and an easy role to step into because of the work that they have laid and the groundwork they have laid before. So thank you. Can we take a moment to recognize our previous chairs? I also want to recognize that it was Matt Lockhart's 50th birthday yesterday, and while he has chosen to spend his birthday with us in Las Vegas, I hope that we can all find some fun ways to help Matt celebrate his birthday with us today. Happy birthday, Matt. So maybe we can have a little song at the reception, possibly. So in one other piece of risk business is that we have received comments back on the greenhouse gas issues summary. Those will be posted, those have been posted, and our response is also being posted today. We appreciate all the comments and efforts from the participants in that panel and the feedback that we've received to date. I'll take a look at the comments and efforts that have been put to bring those today. So those should be posted to the Western EIM Regional Issues Forum website for finalization. And then I believe we have internet available today, and that information is coming shortly in cards. So hang tight for a moment. With that, I think we can turn it over to our first set of panelists. I'm really excited about this Regional Issues Forum that we have 4 new entrants, 3 of whom are presenting today on their decision to join the energy imbalance market. I think this is the most new entrants we've had at a single risk, and I think it's a great example of how this market continues to grow and expand very quickly. So I'll turn it over first to Clay Norris, and I believe we can get his slide up.
Well, thanks, Pam. Some of you already got the joke here. I attended the meeting where Scott presented, and I went to him after the meeting and said, I'm so glad you did that because our story is the same, which means I won't have to tell the story. And then Tony said, no, people really want to hear it. Little did I know, I think that was unfortunately Tony. I think it's Tony's initiation right. So I am Clay Norris, and I am here with Tacoma Power. I'll give you a little background on Tacoma first. We are a municipal entity, and we last year celebrated 125. So it's an old utility. We serve about 175,000 customers. We're part of Tacoma Public Utilities, which is kind of unusual three because we're power, water, and rail. We operate a short line. And we serve those customers. This is virtually carbon-free portfolio. That's based on fuel disclosure, retail sales point of view, which is the way I like to think of it. We're about 140% renewable on it. Our generation comes from Bonneville, a little over half, but also we operate 7 dams. 2019 has not been a normal water year. We're very dry this year, but normally we have a lot of surplus. So now for the stated reason for the presentation, kind of how we came about the decision to join. And mostly I'll share some slides that I shared with our board when we made the decision. And I started with a little history chart. And yes, I am old enough that I have worked in each of these 4 decades and hope to work into this 5th decade. But the point here is that power markets have been changing, and certainly have in my the 80s decade was fairly limited transaction between neighboring utilities. My experience in the Midwest. In the 90s, things opened up with open access and independent power producers, and the whole world changed. In the 2000s, we had a lot of organized markets in the eastern U.S. and California. I'm not sure why I left off that, California. And really robust bilateral markets in the Northwest. This decade has really been about EIM, I think. It's been a big change. Conversations about an extended day-ahead market. And the next decade, who knows? Maybe EDAM, maybe a point for our board members is things are changing. We can't rely on status quo. An important piece for a couple of our board members is just how can we help integrate more renewables in that we think hydro is well suited, unless it's spilling. And this was an important point for a couple other board members. We can't just rely on status quo. We model what's changing there. So our benefit analysis is relative to status quo. But we recognize that our ability to act in the market is changing, and we identified a number of risks. What we're seeing is real-time trading volumes are decreasing with our after they joined the energy imbalance market. We're seeing increasing transactions with some of the wind entities. But those are wind generators outside of EIM. If they join EIM, we think that will probably dry up. And so even though we have a lot of flexibility in our portfolio, our real-time traders get nervous when you have to lock everything down. This is a summary of our costs. I don't think they're a lot different than many other entities, and we tried to be fairly conservative because as a public entity. So hopefully this is sufficient, but it's a lot of software, it's a lot of costs, it's a lot of human costs. And that's just to get us started, and then there are ongoing costs. So the question is, are there enough benefits to really offer? And unlike, I think, pretty much every other EIM entity, we did not use a consultant. We built our own. But this model is really looking at what the situation was at the time that we would have made a bid based on forward prices and target elevations of our reservoirs. Bid in based on that knowledge, so it didn't really rely on perfect foresight. We ran a lot of scenarios, and we looked at a distribution of those scenarios. And what it showed is there are some scenarios, and we're transparent about this with our board, there are some scenarios where extrapolating from the last couple of years of history. But there are a lot of scenarios where we do recover those costs. And so we estimated about a 70% chance of breaking even or coming out ahead. But the reasons that we recommended joining were broader than just the costs and benefits. In fact, the economics were probably fairly low on the list of reasons. We need to modernize our wholesale practices, so some of this money we need to spend anyway. It prepares us for a possible future like an extended day-ahead market. We're really concerned about the risk, loss of liquidity in real time. And we think it improves reliability in a future. We live in Washington, which has introduced or passed legislation that we're going to be 100%. How to do that today. And the last bullet was benefits. Happy to entertain questions at this. Or I guess I have one more slide, sorry. What have we done since? Well, actually this started back almost 2 years ago. We did become a CAISO scheduling coordinator. We had not been prior to that. And we've done cost-benefit analyses. We got board approval. We signed the implementation agreement in August. We've hired Utilicast. I'm sure that'll surprise everybody. As our system integrator. And we've done an RFP for software. We're evaluating bids now. So that's kind of where we are in the process, just really at the beginning, trying to get our arms around this beast. So with that, let me pause for questions, unless you want to hold them.
I think we can go ahead and take some questions. Any questions from the audience? Jennifer.
Thanks, Clay, for that presentation. My question is really focused on your point regarding, you said that there are some scenarios where we don't recover our costs, but it sounds like a lot more where you do, and I think you said about a 70% chance of breaking even or coming out ahead with EIM. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the scenarios in which you're not able to recover costs versus the scenarios where you are?
Yes, it's a good question. One of the uncertainties that we modeled was liquidity. Because our fleet is hydro, it has a fairly robust amount of liquidity most of the time. But we're unsure whether the historic liquidity would continue or not. And so we ran a scenario with less liquidity. We're also not certain about transmission availability, and so we ran a couple scenarios. Transmission that would enable us to participate. I think there was a third, but I've forgotten what it was.
I also have a question for you. Well, I'm curious about the model that you built and what kind of your data sources were in order to build that up and execute.
Yeah, it was a historic model, so it used EIM pricing, LMP pricing. It also used the forward prices in like mid-C pricing because that's what we would base decisions on. And then we, historically, the way we operate our dams is we kind of set a target elevation based on flow forecasts and weather forecasts and load forecasts. And so we had that in a historic database. We looked at those things and tried to figure out a bid curve that kind of reflected our opportunity costs and also tried to steer us back to that target elevation. So we didn't really change the flows in our re-regulating ponds, kept that the same, but we changed when we ran the generators upstream.
And you think that provides more granularity for a hydro system, for additional value to look at the value of the hydro?
We were comfortable with it for our system. I can't really speak to applicability to other systems.
Any other questions? Thank you. Next, we have James McFall, and I believe your presentation should just be able to move forward. Yep. Excellent.
All right, good afternoon. My name is James McFall. I'm the Assistant General Manager for the Electric Resources Division at the Modesto Irrigation District. I've got a simple slide deck for you today. I think probably the presentation is going to be a little different than what you're used to since it's typically entity specific. We've got a lot of entities to deal with, so I'm going to kind of go from a kind of a higher level point of view here. So we'll talk a little bit about the Balancing Authority of Northern California. We'll talk about Bank's EIM phased approach. I'll give you a little bit of background on MID, and then we'll talk about decision drivers and challenges. So Bank is a joint powers agency formed by Modesto, City of Redding, City of Roseville, SMUD, Trinity PUD, and the City of Shasta Lake. It became operational on May 1st, 2011. We've got about 5,000 megawatts of peak load. Bank provides BAA services as well as it also serves as the EIM entity for the EIM participation. This is just a simple graphic to give you an indication of where Bank is and where its members are sort of situated in Northern California here, and you can sort of see the ties to the California ISO. You can see we have a tie to the Northwest as well as a tie to our neighboring VA in the south there, TID. So the Bank Balancing Authority area is made up of the Bank members, so that's the JPA members, as well as the WAPA Sierra Nevada region. And the interesting part about Bank is that it operates functionally as two highly coordinated sub-BAs, and that's how we refer to these areas. So you've got the SMUD BA, or sub-BA, which is controlled by all of its metered boundaries, and then you've got the WAPA SNR sub-BA, and that contains not only WAPA, but the rest of all the Bank members. So this interesting arrangement will come into play as we talk about how we decided to move forward with our EIM implementation. But Bank, the JPA, has the overall requirement and obligation to operate the Balancing Authority area, and we contract that ability through SMUD. So SMUD actually operates the entire BAA as well as it has its own sub-BAA, okay, and then WAPA operates a sub-BAA as well. So an interesting arrangement. It works pretty well, and it does come into play here as we start talking about our EIM implementation. So when we started looking at EIM participation a few years ago, it became obvious fairly early on that because EIM is set up for BAs to participate and not smaller entities like Modesto, there were some sort of BA level issues that we weren't ready to address, I guess. They looked like pretty big hurdles to us. As we went deeper into the study process, SMUD determined, hey, this looks like it's going to work for us. They were already operating the balancing authority. They had the systems and the people in place to handle those BA level issues. And so we decided as a group that okay, SMUD's going to go in first. We're going to call that phase 1. And then we're going to leave open the possibility that the rest of us will participate in what might be a phase 2. We would obviously have to figure out how to do that. So SMUD started working its way towards implementation. On April 3rd of this year, they've been operating in the EIM since then. By all accounts, from the ISO and from SMUD staff, it was probably one of the smoothest EIM implementations to date. I think there's a few reasons for that. The adjacency to the ISO, the familiarity with the California markets, SMUD already had systems and people in place to interface and to handle settlements and things. So it was a lot of familiar stuff, even though EIM was fairly new as you know, the systems and the work and the interfaces and stuff. But for the most part, SMUD was pretty comfortable with the ISO being adjacent to them already. So the implementation went really well. They did have to staff an EIM scheduling desk, but they expect a payback of about 2 years on that. So while they were doing that, the rest of us were looking at phase 2, and it became apparent to us that the only way to make this work is if we could somehow leverage SMUD's systems and abilities. Since they already had the staffing in place, they already had systems, they're already operating as a BA. If they could handle some of these BA level issues for us, then we could move beyond those hurdles and figure out, okay, what's left for the rest of us to do. And so once that light bulb sort of went off for all of us, we moved on from there and we started studying what each individual entity would have to do. And I'll talk about some of the gaps and challenges in a bit here. But so phase 2, in addition to the bank members, Western also decided somewhere along that timeline that they wanted to participate in EIM as well. And so we wrapped them into the effort and we started studying things. Before I get into gaps, let me just give you a little quick hit on MID. So we were established in 1887. We do provide electricity for our service territory. We have, obviously, irrigation water that we provide to our local farmers. And we also operate a water treatment plant where we take surface water, treat it, and wholesale it to the city of Modesto for use of their retail customers. We began service in 1923, electric service, I should say. Got about 129,000 accounts, an all-time peak of 700 megawatts, and about 475 megawatts of internal generation. So this gap analysis is just EIM is MID specific in this case, but a lot of these things also translate over to some of the other entities in bank as well. I've got up here no major gaps identified. Now that's with once we set aside those BA level issues that were major hurdles for us. We set those aside. We've got those figured out because we're going to contract with SMUD to help us out on those things. So you set those aside. Really, there's nothing big left. There's some things we have to do, obviously. The biggest is probably procure some software for market bidding, settlements, meter data collection and submittal, and we'll need some help with post-market. But for the most part, we've already got software modules for interfacing with the ISO. You know, we are an SC already, so we do interface with the ISO already. We are familiar with ISO settlements, so these software modules will just be EIM specific for us. So not a major hurdle at this point. Another thing that I think I've heard has been an issue for other entities is meter upgrades. Turns out for us, we identified some generation meter upgrades, but the really positive thing for us was we had already identified this project before we had decided to join EIM. So this project was already up and running. So for EIM, all we have to do is make sure that we complete this project so that we can meet our EIM timeline. So again, not a major hurdle. And then just as an example of some other kind of minor issues, we've got a 25 megawatt solar facility in our system. We don't own or operate it. We take the power off of it via PPA, but we'll have to sign up for some kind of forecasting service for that. And then benefits for MID, I think I probably should have bolded the first bullet because really this was the major driver in my mind, was to ensure that going forward we have access to a robust resource pool. As more and more folks join EIM and as EDAM continues to gain momentum, I think the thought of not participating in that market is just not feasible. I think to be blunt, you'd get left out in the cold, and we'd have a very illiquid market to access at that point. So that was the major driver. You're going to get some increased reliability, but of course, integration of additional variable resources. Being a California entity, this is a big deal for us. So having that enhanced resource diversity and just the finer timelines on the market, I think, are going to help greatly with that for us. Another thing for us is being a smaller entity, a load-serving entity. Really, most of our trading revolves around just balancing our load. We do some market trading above and beyond that, but it's pretty limited. So having resources and load constantly in the market, I think, is going to be a big benefit for us. Monetize things and optimize our portfolio a little better than we can do for ourselves right now. Estimated gross benefits, a couple $1 million a year. Implementation costs, we think it's up to $3 million. I don't think it's going to be that much. I don't have it on here, but ongoing costs are expected to be somewhere south of $1 million a year, so we're expecting a payback in about 3 years on that. And then, so again, Bank has this phased approach. Phase 1 was SMUD. Phase 2 is all the rest of us. Some interesting, I guess, challenges for us Phase 2 participants is just the coordination of our efforts. So we've got all these entities, and we each kind of have our own approach. We're each situated slightly differently. We're going to lean on SMUD for certain things and not other things. Our transmission access differs greatly between all of the entities. You've got SMUD with their own access to the ISO and to the other sub-BA. You've got WAPA with its own transmission network. MID has direct access to the ISO, to TID, to the sub-BA, and then you've got folks like Reading and Roseville who are entirely dependent on transmission access through WAPA. So determining how ETSRs are set, determining how the transmission usage and accounting, and things along those lines. There are other contractual arrangements that we all have in order to operate the sub-BAs. We have to make sure that when one of us makes a decision or chooses a direction, it's going to be compatible with the decisions and the directions of everyone else, and to make sure that when we set things up, that the BAA as a whole, the participation in EIM is maximized for the whole BAA and not just for one particular entity. So it's been interesting to try to work through this effort. Like I said, the coordination is a big issue for us, but we're getting through it. We're working our way through it. And then determining, each of us will have to determine what we take on ourselves, what we contract with SMUD. Each of us are situated a little bit differently, so we'll have to make that determination as we go along. And then another unique thing, at least from my perspective, is allocation of costs. We've got a committee set up that's going through every EIM charge code to determine how things will be allocated. Being a California muni who has, along with the rest of us in California, has long banged the drums of cost causation, it's a little bit different approach for us when you have these charges flowing through that are somewhat socialized. So we have to determine how to allocate some of these charges. So that's a little bit of a different exercise for us. And with that, if anyone has any questions.
Anyone with a question? Well, I have one on your charge code process.
Okay.
As you're working through this, if you find any unique or different opportunities for charge code allocation, will you report back to us on your assessments?
I think there are always unique opportunities. It's getting everyone to agree on what's acceptable, right? That's where the challenge is. I think a lot of times we've just fallen back on, because that's the way we allocate kind of our balancing our BAA charges, is we've fallen to load ratio share for now until we come up with something better.
And I think I have a second question that is for both you and Clay, and that is, you both have, your current implementations have benefited from previous learnings and lessons from Bank Phase 1 and from your participation as a scheduling coordinator. And if you could maybe talk about some of the lessons and the values of having some pre-work or pre-knowledge before beginning the implementation process. That's very interesting.
I think from my perspective, it's just having the experience of just understanding what ISO settlements are and how much work goes into those things. You know, we didn't have that big surprise, I think, that some of the other entities had who've never dealt with the ISO settlements before. And then just, like I said, just the adjacency and you know, having already having that relationship with your neighboring, with what is your neighboring BA and your neighboring entity, when you do transmission planning studies and things like that, you're already sort of looking into those systems already, so your network models are, you know, kind of mostly there already. So I think that was, for us, you know, those were some big hurdles that we didn't have to tackle up front.
I would say for us, well, first of all, let me preface, we do a very small volume as scheduling coordinator, but the real value was in just getting operators comfortable with some of the language, some of how it works, you know, the ahas when it doesn't work, and, you know, it's not what you expected, and, you know, so kind of learning with small consequences has some value. And we also took the unusual route, because it was small volume. We're doing reconciliations manually with a spreadsheet. I don't think anybody does that. But it was a big learning curve for folks, and I think those involved really got a deeper understanding and are really looking forward to having software that is commercially provided, which will come soon.
Thank you. And our last presenter is Dan Severson from Turlock Irrigation District.
There you go. Thank you. Dan Severson, Energy Markets Department Manager at Turlock Irrigation District. Very happy to be here. Really appreciate the invite. I will echo a lot of what my colleague said to the right, so I'll try and highlight the differences that TID has in comparison to Modesto. We are an old entity as well. We were the first irrigation district in California by, what, 2 days, James? Something like that. I put a week here, but it's actually 2 days. He was waiting for that. We work very closely with Modesto. We share a tie. We share a hydro resource, and we're just right across the river. Established in 1887, publicly owned, 5-member locally elected board of directors, 453 employees, all extremely happy to work there. 4,500 growers, and we irrigate roughly, just short of 150,000 acres. The last I checked. Similar to MID, we did start providing electric power service in 1923, and we are just over 100,000 electric retail accounts. That's a picture of our service territory. The green being the electric service territory, and the orange being our historic irrigation territory. The area to the, what is that? That's west, Patterson. We bought that service territory from PG&E in 2003, just before we became our own balancing authority. So, as I mentioned, independent balancing area. 2001 was a big driver for us in that decision. Our ratepayers and our management at the time did not want to expose ourselves to any more rolling blackouts, et cetera, So we built quite a bit of thermal generation and formed a balancing area. We have one wholesale all requirements customer, but other than that, it's just TID operating to serve TID. We do have an extremely diverse portfolio we're very proud of: natural gas, hydro, solar, wind, geo, and biomass. 522 megawatts of thermal. The linchpin on that is a 250 megawatt combined cycle unit. We also have 4 48 megawatt LM6000s that are quick start, and those are resources that we think we're really going to be able to leverage in EIM. 203 megawatts of large hydro internal to our BA that we can switch back and forth with MID and bank onto their bus. A few megawatts of small hydro. We do have 137 megawatt wind farm that we purchased in 2008, currently in the BPA Balancing Authority. That's kind of an interesting story. We actually bought the farm. The financial crisis happened right as we were about to sign the PPA, and financing fell through. So we bought the wind farm, and we've learned quite a bit over the last few years, owning and operating it, and scheduling it, and it's been a process. 54 megawatts of solar. That's a PPA in South Path. 8 megawatts of geothermal through NCPA, and then the recently mandated biomass, which we're super excited about. Peak load of about 600 megawatts, and pretty clean resource portfolio. 30% RPS eligible, and we were early actors. We were able to carry a lot of those recs forward, and so I don't think we're going to have to make another addition 2023 or 2024 or so. You're all very familiar with this. As EIM balancing authorities, we do have interconnections with bank, as James mentioned, and the ISO. We have roughly 600 megawatts of transfer capabilities to both VAs. It has been an education, as James mentioned. We do share some facilities, and so I've been getting an education, a whole new vocabulary about mirrors and ETSRs and all kinds of new things that we're going to have to work through. It's going to be challenging, but at the end, we think there's pretty clear benefits. So what do we come to consider when in making this decision? And similar to my colleagues, and I'm sure many of you, the loss of liquidity really drove us to take a pretty hard look at this. And this is something that we've been looking at, probably since 2016 or so. We really have been seeing a drop-off in trading partners in the bilateral hourly markets, and it is having an effect. And it is increasing costs. And as you're all aware, the extension to the day-ahead market, I think, while will be hugely beneficial, I think there's, as you're all aware, a lot of issues to work out. But we didn't want to fall behind, as James said. And while that was being worked out, we did have experience in operating in the Cal ISO market, and so that was kind of an easy thing. So really, reduction in purchase power and fuel costs. We had access to a larger network of energy providers, and increased revenue from sales, and then increased purchase megawatt hours. So what are the cost savings components of our analysis? Mainly, we get access to the broader ISO footprint within the hour. We also get access without paying the export fees, which can add up. And then it also eliminates the need to hold back a certain amount of capacity and energy for uncertainty. You said it, and well, this is my Pollyanna kind of understanding of how EIM works, and I stand to be corrected. You said it, forget it, and the market just magically makes everything happen. And so we do have, I mentioned A2PP, that's an internal acronym, that's for the Almond 2 power plant. That's our fleet of LM6000s. We do think that we'll be able to leverage those units both up and down in the EIM market. So we looked at 2016. We did hire Utilocast to do a gap assessment. We did an internal production cost model benefit calculation. There was pretty clear benefits about a fairly quick payback due to the uncertainties at the time. We've had some, in addition to some management turnover, we chose not to go forward. At the time, we still had a few questions about how EIM would develop. Fast forward to last year, we hired Ascend Analytics to perform a new study and to help us determine the benefits of joining EIM. And then Utilocast did an update to their previously done cost-benefit analysis. I don't know why I included this slide. I think it just makes things confusing, but I guess what I wanted to highlight is that in our analysis, we wanted to evaluate this joining the 15-minute market versus the EIM, and so it's a graphic that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. So here's our results. So we evaluated the non-EIM 15-minute only. As you can see there, generation costs were down in both scenarios. Wholesale purchase costs were up. The real difference maker was the amount of sales revenue that we're projecting in the full EIM model. That is really the driver of our decision to go forward. So we looked at what would have happened in 2017, and we applied exactly that scenarios because it was known, load, gen, forecast, hydro year, et cetera, et cetera. And roughly $1 million in savings in the 15-minute only scenario and around 4.5 in the full EIM. And then we projected that out to 2022 using the forward curves in place at the time, not only for power and gas, but for greenhouse gas allowance prices. So we're projecting that the benefits will grow, and my board is going to hold me to that, so it better come through. The gap analysis revealed we already were going to upgrade our EMF system. It's simply a market module that needs to be added. You know, various hardware, software, training for everybody, myself especially, and then we're really trying to get through this without adding a full-time desk. We're going to go as staff both on the merchant side and the ops side, and then we're adding one additional settlements analyst. Most of the people that we've talked to, a lot of you in the room, have definitely made that clear that the settlements can be a bear, and so we got approval to hire an analyst. So there's really this is the general. Our startup costs are just over 5.5. We have some ongoing costs of just under $100,000 a year, and some potential benefits there that make it attractive. And so far, I've been having a pretty good relationship with management and the board because it all looks rosy right now. Here's our timeline. March 26th of this year, we went to the board with asking for authorization to proceed. They agreed. In April, we hired Utilicast. I'm sure that's no surprise. In May, we signed the implementation agreement with the ISO. Hello, Mr. Fuller, back there. May 28th, we had our internal EIM project kickoff meeting. I'm the project manager. We have key people in each area: settlements, operations, merchant, IT, and CalISO relations, and EMS. And then on June 14th, the CalISO came down. We had a kickoff meeting, and it was very informative. I imagine this swim lane and this kind of diagram is familiar to a lot of you. This is a representation on kind of where we are. You'll see in yellow the EMF upgrade, and we're also upgrading our outage management system in conjunction. And we do view that as the biggest risk or threat to having a successful project. We did just make an award on the scheduling system software, both on the ops and I'm sorry, I got to speak the right language, the entity side and the participating resource side. Last week, we're in the process of contracting just this week, and then we're also interviewing for a settlements analyst next week. And that's all I have. Happy to take questions.
Any questions from the audience? Operator, can we see if there are any questions for any of our panelists on the phone?
To ask a question, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please then state your name and question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
I have one question for you, Dan.
Yeah.
I agree that EIM can be magic if set up well, and I was wondering if you had any considerations or concerns with the diversity of resources that you're putting into the market. I don't think I've seen quite a resource list that has quite as diverse set of resources as yours does, and if all of them would be participating or if you're still working through some of those questions.
I wouldn't characterize it as concerns. I think we have kind of thrived on a diversified portfolio. As far as participating resources, we plan on having all internal to the entity participate. I just wanted to, one clarification is we have a fairly large hydro resource that, for the purposes of this modeling, was excluded.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So when you were doing the cost-benefit study, it looks like you were comparing joining the 15-minute market only versus EIM, which is something I personally haven't seen before. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision to compare those two options, and then whether you can highlight anything specifically about EIM that led to those pretty significant production cost benefits, sort of in addition to a 15.
Sure. Really, the 15-minute scenario was driven by the fact that we were going to upgrade our EMF system anyway to be able to participate in the 15-minute market. So really, the benefits are a delta between those two scenarios. The EIM analysis really captured what's it called? Volatility, right? More volatility at more times of the year, both up and down seasonally. That's where really rubber meets the road as far as the increased benefit.
Thank you all for your presentation, and we're excited about your decision to join the EIM. And with that, I think we can let you return to your seats and invite the next three panelists to come forward. So our next panel is a discussion of resource adequacy and resource efficiency. And this idea is really about understanding some of the fundamental differences between these two concepts and how they apply to the market today, and how some of these concepts are being brought up through the region. And so we have panelists Don Trethewey from the ISO, Tian Gosa from PGE, and Clay MacArthur from Deseret to present on three different aspects of these two concepts, and Don will be presenting first.
Good afternoon. Don Trethewey, Senior Advisor for Market Design Policy at the ISO. I think the simplest difference between resource adequacy and resource efficiency is really the time frame and their purpose. Resource adequacy is ensuring on a forward basis that you've contracted with sufficient steel in the ground so that you can meet your monthly peaks, your annual peaks. It's really about a forward basis in terms of making sure that you can serve your load. Resource efficiency evaluations is really a series of tests to ensure that someone's not inappropriately leaning on the energy imbalance market on a short-term basis. And so I'll go in and describe each of them in a little more detail. So the resource efficiency evaluation, there's 4 tests that they're performed hourly. And the first one is a feasibility test. And the feasibility test is informational to the EIM entity as to whether or not there's unresolved congestion in their base schedules that they've submitted. And since we perform these tests 3 times prior to the operating hour, it does give the EIM entity an opportunity to the extent that they can address that unresolved congestion. They can do that prior to the final base schedule submission. The next is a balancing test, and that is used to, in the event that a EIM entity is elected to use the CAISO's load forecast, this ensures that they have sufficient generation to meet that load within a tolerance band, and if you're within that tolerance band, you're not subject to under and over scheduling penalties. And it's just the possibility of them, because there's tiers on that you need to exceed from a deviation standpoint from your base schedules. The next two are around making sure you have sufficient participating resources. The first one's a capacity test, where we look to see if the participating resources bid range can basically solve the 15-minute load forecast in the hour. And if you're unable to perform that in a given 15-minute interval, then you're not allowed to participate in additional transfers above and beyond what had occurred prior to when you had failed that interval. The next is a ramping test to ensure that you have sufficient flexibility to ramp from a 15-minute interval from the last hour, then a 30-minute interval, a 45-minute interval, and a 60-minute interval. And on that test as well, if you have insufficient ramping capability to meet one of those, then you're not allowed to get additional transfers from others in the EIM. And so it's not testing to see whether you have whether you're going to meet your reliability requirements. It's simply, have you met the agreed upon threshold from which you can now participate and benefit from the overall energy imbalance market by transacting with your neighbors. When you go to a resource adequacy framework, now you are making sure that you can reliably run your system because you've procured on a forward basis sufficient capacity so that you can meet, from a system basis, your peak load plus your planning reserve margins. We also have local reliability requirements where we make sure that in certain areas we have sufficient generation there. And then we also ensure that we have sufficient flexible resources that can provide the ramping capabilities that we need in order to know that we have sufficient resources. There's some of the confusion right there. Know that we have adequate resources to reliably run our system through our markets. And so if you have a very strong resource adequacy program, then you have procured the sufficient resources to where passing the resource efficiency test should be something that you should be able to routinely accomplish.
Don. Next we have Tian Gosa from PTE. And I think for this one, unless there are clarifying questions, we will hold questions till the end.
My name is Tian Gosa. I'm from Portland General Electric. I work on power operation floor, which is the merchant floor of PGE, where we do this work every day, especially around the resource efficiency. But I'll start from the resource adequacy for mainly around PGE. Of course, we don't have per se what we consider resource adequacy. We have the IRP process for those things. Unlike the California ISO, they have a methodology and a set rules on how to identify an entity is adequate. Portland General Electric uses the IRP process. And the IRP process differs depending on who does it. There isn't a set rule, so that makes it a little bit challenging to prove if you're resource efficient or resource adequate. But we try to do those with the same methodology every time. And if there are questions that come up, let's say from our regulators, we go back and do different kind of studies. For example, in the past, the long past, what we've done is we kind of used 12% what we call reserve margins. You hear that around resource adequacy. Reserve margins to see if we have adequate amount of resources to be able to meet our normal peak load, what we would say 1 and 2 peak load. But lately, though, as things are getting tighter because of, retirement, the PUC has asked us and recommended, and we agreed that maybe a different methodology should be used, because in our IRP, we always mention the market also. About this much of it is for short, we can utilize the market. So that was becoming challenging as more and more resources are coming on. So the last IRP, we actually tried to do more of a loss of load probability, and as well as using the Power Conservation Council methodology of how they quasi-do if the region does have adequate resources, because the Pacific Northwest is reliant, as some of you know, reliant heavily on hydro, and hydro does not, most of the time it's too short, so folks were starting to have concerns. So we started to utilize the IRP, for, utilizing to see if the market is going to be even there. In the past, it was simple. They went to the merchants on the other side, say, how much do you think you can buy this house? And then we put that in. But now we're starting to implement more thoughtful way of seeing if there's going to be market liquidity. So that's a much more recent change PGE has done to make sure when their merchants floor tells them I can have this, it can actually be there. So, and we lean on a lot of the Power Council's information to do those studies. So it's not per se standard way of making sure you're adequate, but we're trying to come up with a more robust process, at least for PGE. And there are also, as most of you know, regional conversation also to see if there are other ways the region outside of, the California ISO to make sure we have some way of assuring resource adequacy. And I'm sure some of you participate in that process, so we are trying to come up also with standardized way of seeing if we can do regional adequacy in the Pacific area. Now, in operation, resource adequate sufficiency, now I'm going to transition to the sufficiency like Don described. California has certain steps where they check, 4 steps where they check for capacity, balancing, feasibility, and flexibility. So that's a step-by-step process. But in operation, you have to make sure also what we call outages, availability. Those kind of things are impact the hour-to-hour testing that has to be done also. So that's the part usually the operation folks have to deal with outside of, what is outside of basically the BPM is how does outage impact also your testing. So when they're doing the testing, if you, say T-minus 75, you pass it, things change. In the next, by T-minus 55, you could fail it. Because there are data movements that get in the way of the data that you thought was going to show up is pulled out. So those kind of things are what makes resource sufficiency interesting when you are operating in it. But sometimes there are some changes that have done because there are times where we have failed flex for half a megawatt. That's painful failure. So those kind of things, we're working with CalISO to fix, to work around them. Maybe there is a wiggle room that we can have, and that change has been implemented. But when you take these rules into operations and the step-by-step processes that have to happen to pass it every time is interesting or sometimes challenging, especially sometimes when for those that have not been in it yet, that we're going to be starting in the EIM. Those are the steps you would practice during, your parallel ops and all of that. And get used to it. It gets easier as time passes by because we've been in this now, PGE, for 2 years, so folks are getting used to it, and the continual change and learning will have to continue in this process. So that's all I have. This is more from operations side and operation look of differences between the two.
Good afternoon. My name is Clay MacArthur. I am with Deseret Power, and I am the publicly owned utility sector representative to the Regional Issues Forum. And want to start off with a public service announcement. Tony is over here. Tony, raise your hand, is the other publicly owned utility sector representative. And I want to start out with a public service announcement that if I was looking at our publicly owned utility sector list on the Western EIM website last night, and I think it's quite a bit out of date. And so if you are a publicly owned utility, I would ask you to go to the website, to the westerneim.com website, check your organization or your entity's contact information, and if it is out of date or needs to be updated, please submit it. There's just a lot of names on the list that of retirees and or missing names for entities that are currently would fall into that sector, and so we want to make sure that we have an up-to-date contact list because it's important to be able to communicate with our sector. So on behalf of Tony and myself, please take a look at that.
I would expand that to all the sectors. I think that all of us in this room could stand taking a look and seeing if we are correctly represented on those contact lists and see if we can get those updated.
Great. So just a little bit about Deseret Power. We are an electric cooperative headquartered in Salt Lake City, but we have operations in 4 different balancing authorities. 2 of them are currently EIM entities or participating in the EIM. A 3rd one will join in 2021, and the 4th one, the fourth one is currently looking at an alternate energy imbalance market design. Deseret also has a EIM participating resource in the energy imbalance market, and we offer that via a third-party scheduling coordinator. Today I'm going to highlight or bring forward to this body an issue that we have seen arise in the energy imbalance market. We view it as a seams issue, that as you transition from a bilateral market to an LMP market, there's some seams issues that can arise, and we want to highlight one and then walk maybe through some examples of how that can impact market results, and then highlights, because I don't think that you can just bring forward problems and leave it at that, we want to bring forward some proposals that we feel like would help address the issue that we're going to raise. So as Dawn mentioned, in the early stages of the design of the energy imbalance market, in the mists before time when this market was being set up, it was determined that this market should not permit or not allow for leaning on the market. That's perceived as a bad thing. And so these sufficiency tests were set up, and there's 4 of them. And the one test that I'm going to focus on is what Dawn called the feasibility test. I've also called it heard it called the transmission feasibility test, the deliverability test, the power flow feasibility test, and several other names. But it's the feasibility. The test is really a test to see whether internal to a BA resources can get to load. And it's just a simple test that looks for congestion on the system. And the question that we will ask is, if that test comes back and says, no, there is a schedule that is not able to get, or a resource that cannot get to load, what happens? So let's see. Here we go. So these 4 resource sufficiency tests really set up a strong gate that stands between the traditional bilateral market and the new LMP market, which is the energy imbalance market. And that gate has to be strongly enforced, that you can't have leakage across that gate where things that should have been resolved in bilateral market are left to the energy imbalance market because that creates leaning. And so some of the concerns or some of the things that this gate protects against are cost shifts. So if you go into the hour and something was left unresolved until the energy imbalance market, it can result in a cost shift. Additionally, if you have neutrality charges or inflated neutrality charges, those costs are not making it into the LMP development process, and that represents, we want all of the information that is known to the market at the time that the LMP is developed to go into the LMP and not show up in a neutrality charge. And then, of course, if you do that, then you will minimize those neutrality and uplift charges. So here are the 4 sufficiency tests that Don spoke of. And the question is the feasibility test or the transmission feasibility test, is it mandatory? Anybody know the answer to that? I don't. But what happens then if it is not binding? So let's walk through an example. So I'm going to have to turn around for this. And there's really 2 scenarios that I'm going to talk about here. And it's the top half of the screen and then the second half of the screen or the bottom half of the screen. We'll try to turn around and get this done. So up here is the scenario, the first scenario where you go into the hour with a base schedule. And you have a generator you have a generator that is scheduling or has a base schedule of 100 megawatts. And this is all internal to the same balancing authority. You have a generator offering or scheduling 100 megawatts across the transmission line to serve a 100 megawatt load that is remote to it. In addition, there is a second generator that I have placed in this scenario just adjacent to the load that would not be subject to transmission constraints. If, after the base schedules are submitted, a transmission constraint develops, then what the energy imbalance market would do is it would dispatch down this resource here, generator 1, and it would increase the generator 2 dispatch to compensate for the loss of generator 1. And that is a great result because that's what the energy imbalance market was designed to do. The question comes up is, what if this constraint was known ahead of time by hours, days, or weeks, and yet this base schedule was accepted, and this base schedule to this load was accepted. The challenge is that what happens is you get a neutrality charge that could have been avoided. That since it was known and foreseeable, it could have been avoided, and the only entity that could have done anything about it is the entity that is that's scheduling, that's submitting these base schedules. But what happens is this cost that develops down here, and I've generated a robust congestion offset charge here by saying that the generator 1, which is in the export constrained region, had a bid to or an offer to back down of $150, negative $150 a megawatt hour, and the generator over here offered to increase its generation for $25 a megawatt hour. I'm just estimating that the congestion offset charge would be about $15,000. So traditionally, if you were under the FERC pro forma tariff, the energy or the BA would have come in and whacked the schedule of generator 1 and said, that's not feasible. You can't deliver that. You have to shut down your generator for reliability reasons, and then generator 2 would be started up to serve the load, and the entity that is kind of the owner of this portfolio would incur the imbalance charge. In this case, though, if this constraint was known ahead of time, before the start of the energy imbalance market, this congestion offset, which really represent or is representative of the cost that should have been incurred by the entity owning this portfolio, is allocated across all load-serving entities in the footprint. So is that a good result? Is that the intended result? And I would say that it is not a good result, because what you will do then is you will incentivize by not enforcing the feasibility test. You incent entities to go into the hour with infeasible base schedules, and then those costs are subsidized by other load-serving entities in the region that may have had no ability to mitigate those costs. And so this is something that we are concerned about, and in addition to that, I'll kind of follow on because we're going to talk about this in a minute. One of the issues that we have in addition to that is over in Region 2, there would be a market power mitigation applied because you have a single supplier over here and they have market power. Over in Region 1, because it's a decremental bid, our local market power mitigation does not apply in the negative direction, and so a negative bid, which can also be market abusive, would not be constrained in the negative direction. So this could really drive some inflated neutrality charges, and that's a concern to us. And we have seen, I have been contacted by several entities, publicly owned utilities in various regions that are concerned with some of the neutrality charges that they have seen, and this is one potential source of those neutrality charges. And so we're bringing this forward to the group. And so we kind of have some proposals now. The first one is we are requesting, and I'll give an example in a minute. The question is, where should the tariff language occur? Should it occur at the EIM entity level, or should it occur or be developed at the market operator level? Our preference would be at the market operator level, because then it's universally applied across the region, the EIM footprint. If it is applied just at the EIM entity level, it can create maybe some distortionary results. Maybe different EIM entities may have different versions or different tariff language that tries to address this in different ways, and that can create distortionary effects in the market. In addition, we are proposing, so I'll give you an example in my next slide of tariff language addressing and requiring feasible base schedules. And then in addition, we are requesting that local market power mitigation be expanded to address bids in the negative direction when market power exists. So right now, we only address bids in the positive direction when market power exists, but we're saying that whenever market power exists, there should be mitigation applied in both the positive and the negative directions. In addition, we're also looking for increased market transparency, and I'm going to modify this on the fly here from what my slide says. And I would say that what we're really asking for is increased transparency into the neutrality charges. We would like to see what the neutrality charges are from the market operator, and we want to know what they are. And then also, it would be helpful if market participants could see the results of the force sufficiency tests. We're not asking for this resource failed, this resource passed. We're just looking for a 0 or a 1 for each interval that is assessed from the market operator. And then we have an indication of what is driving. It gives us insight into the market and why the market is performing the way that it is. We know if it was a sufficiency test, and that's why the prices in our region spiked to $1,000, and every region around us is at $18. Or we kind of get a sense of what's going on, and then we can kind of work on addressing those issues inside of the market, and we just have greater transparency and greater understanding of where the market's going. So I say here, the exposing the determinants files, this is an ongoing request of ours, but really it's broader than that. We want to know what the neutrality charges are that are being allocated and then sub-allocated through the EIM entities to their transmission customers, and also the results of the sufficiency tests. So here is an example of proposed tariff language. I recognize that it's an eye chart and that it is maybe a little bit deep to get into right here, but I just want to put that out there as proposed language or template for proposed language. This is actually an attempt to address the feasibility test at the EIM entity level, and as I said before, that's not my preferred solution. My preferred solution is addressed at the market operator level, but we would also be happy if it was addressed at the EIM entity level. So with that, I appreciate your time and the opportunity to bring this to the group for consideration.
Scott, I see you have a question. Yes, for questions, we have both the floater mic or the podium if you want to make your way to the podium.
So I'm struggling to understand this issue because I guess it's because of the unique nature of the EIM and how transmission is allocated. I mean, in a full network system, this difficulty wouldn't arise, would it? I think I'm definitely putting that at Don.
This arises because the market is going to redispatch because the base schedules have flows that exceed the transmission limit. So you're backing down generator 1 and inking generator 2. And this is why we give the information to the EIM entities to say you're going to result in an uplift here. So you want to take actions to resolve that. Otherwise, you're going to have a large uplift account, which actually provides the transparency to the market that there is a lot of unresolved congestion. So you are getting the right price signals on this. Right. And when we did the reason we also, we isolate each individual balancing authority area's real-time congestion offset so that they're each responsible for the constraints located within their system. And so we provide this information, to provide them transparency and prior to the EIM, these costs were being incurred. No one even knew or quantified how much they actually were. And so what it actually does is it highlights the magnitude of the problem that was existing prior to the EIM because there was a lot of stuff that was having to get redispatched or curtailed, and you didn't even know what the actual cost was associated with it. So I view this as, offsets are that everyone thinks they're bad, but what they really are doing is they're telling you the magnitude of an issue that you might need to address. And so if this was a regular occurrence, you'd be, we need to have some discussion about what someone's doing, why is someone unable to learn that their base schedules are continuously doing this. I could see that occasionally it does something because network topology changes and we're quick to react. This shouldn't be like a daily occurrence type thing.
So, Scott, in the example that we're showing here and in our proposal, what we're actually saying is that if this entity that owns generator 1, generator 2, and owns the load, if they are coming into the hour with an infeasible base schedule, the transmission line between generator 1 and load is unavailable, that the EIM entity notify that market participant that they have an infeasible base schedule, then allow that market participant to modify their base schedule, and if they don't, then the EIM entity will come in and they will take this base schedule right here to 0. What that then does is that assigns 100% of the resulting congestion charge to the market participant that created the cost. And so Don's right, this cost was always existing. The question isn't does the cost exist or not, it's who should pay it. If my schedules were balanced and somebody came into the hour with a known transmission infeasibility, why should I pay a share of that? I can't do anything to mitigate that. And so what we're looking for is somebody to come in and say that when infeasible base schedules are identified, there's many different ways to kind of address this. We are just proposing one, and that is that the entity who has the infeasible base schedule is notified of their infeasibility. They're given an opportunity to address it, and if they don't address it, that their infeasible schedule is whacked. It's taken to 0, and then that cost that results is 100% isolated to that entity.
I see what you're saying. The difficulty is that I think, in my mind, and I want to understand it some more. We're talking about what's causing the congestion, and in a large market like this, the congestion isn't always easy to determine that it was this person, and that's why it's allocated normally as congestion charges. That you learn how they go and you sort of adjust from them. This may be a sort of getting to know you kind of exercise. So
think back, or I think even now, think into the world of the unscheduled flow mitigation. If somebody is perpetually if somebody is perpetually scheduling into unscheduled flows or known USF events, and they make it through, they get a big win. Potentially. But if they get curtailed because of unscheduled flow events and they try to declare force majeure, it's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose scenario. And that's what we're trying to prevent here, where somebody is perpetually going into an hour with known base schedule and feasibilities, and if they make it, they're a big winner. But if they don't, then the cost associated with that transmission and feasibility is socialized across the region on load-serving entities that may have had no opportunity or no ability to mitigate that congestion.
I was just going to make a comment about the other part of Scott's question, sort of how is this any different within a full RTO or full network model framework? Well, there is an ultimate recourse, which is if there's enough congestion occurring to justify new transmission, right? So we have a shared transmission planning process within the ISO where, in fact, economic projects can be put forward if they resolve a long-term known congestion. I think the issue here is, EIM is kind of cobbled together with separate balancing areas that have their separate transmission planning processes that result in the transmission that's there and can be leveraged for EIM transactions, but there's no feedback loop that over time says, hey, EIM is generating a lot of congestion along a certain path because there's load over here and good cheap resources over there that can serve that load, or perhaps at certain times of day and year. In a fully integrated RTO type framework, that feedback would flow into the transmission planning process and you try to alleviate some of that congestion.
Well, I mean, this is actually also another benefit of the day-ahead market, because in the day-ahead market, we actually resolve the congestions in our hourly-based schedules, and then our real-time congestion offset is really driven by changes in the network between the day-ahead market and the real-time market that drives the real-time congestion offset.
And you also have congestion revenue, right, or something like that.
But that's only in the day-ahead market time frame. That's not in the real-time.
Yeah, that's right. So if you were a third-party entity and you were trying to hedge yourself against something like this, you could go out and buy a congestion revenue, right, and you could hedge against this. But since we don't have that in the energy imbalance market, you don't have that opportunity.
Therese Hampton, Public Generating Pool. Is this on? Okay. So Clay asked a question at the beginning of this whether this fourth test is binding on resource sufficiency, and I think he said he didn't know the answer. Is this binding or not?
It does not result in your not being allowed to have additional transfers. It's informational to say that you're going to have a real-time congestion offset impact because there's unresolved congestion, but it doesn't prevent them from participating or having additional transfers with the other EIM entities.
So can you elaborate a little bit, just from my understanding, about how are they notified at the time of failure that it's not?
Remember, we run these tests at three times, and we'll notify 3 times whether it's there, and which gives them a chance to cure if they can.
But
and then I think there is sort of a historical learning as well, too, in terms of how to, if you saw this on a repetitive basis, then you would learn how to. It's an informational feedback loop. So it gives an immediate time to cure, but then the offset itself is information to say either feeds into your transmission planning process or how you base schedule process or all of that.
So it's information only, no consequence of the failure. And if you're an LSC in that balancing authority area, will you know about those occurrences?
Well, first, transmission has been built in the West without RTO. It's still built today, and it's going to be built in the future even without RTO. There are other mechanisms to build transmission different than RTO. This system is based on authority of balancing area to balance bilateral schedules. So it's not authority of market operator to curtail these balance schedules. So that's why it's not mandatory. So we are informing EM entities, balancing area, about this congestion in feasible-based schedules every run. We have 3 runs for this test, and every run they see they have enough time to take action. This is based on the current design, old issue, it's not market issue. It's within old to each entity to figure out how they deal with this situation.
Kelsey Brown with Pacificor. So the issue that Clay brought up was something that we had to deal with about a little over 2 years ago now, and this is where we did work with the Cal ISO to make sure that those tasks were being communicated correctly to our EIM entity. We did put a process in place whereby the EM entity at each interval will actually notify the load-serving entities of any infeasible failures, and those are corrected. Those come through as instructions from the EIM entity to the balancing authority areas. In the event, for example, that Deseret, for example, were behind a transmission constraint, that information would be communicated to Deseret. Similarly, it would apply to anyone within the EIM entity balancing area. So we do have a process in place for that currently. Obviously, there's congestion that can still occur within the hour. Obviously, as your loads, so forth, change behind that constraint, you're going to have potentially congestion that can occur that's not related to a base schedule. But I will also say that from an intent perspective, there's really no, in my mind at least, there isn't an incentive to do this because, one, the EM entity must pass, right, the subsequent test. So if you schedule, for example, generation behind a constraint that can't get out, that actually is not counted in your the other tests, the actual physical tests. So your capacity tests, your flex tests, those tests, you will still need to meet those, and those look at what your actual operating capability is. So, for example, if the model sees that that generator will be curtailed, that generation is not counted actually towards your test. So you cannot fake out, if you will, the market. So if you're going into that hour thinking that just because you base schedule these generators that it will actually help you pass some of those tests, you will be very wrong. So you have an incentive to correctly schedule your resources to serve your load because there is settlement consequences for the situation that Clay's referring to, not just in congestion, but obviously even in the outcome relative to the change in dispatch, which is not always what you expected. So there's definitely incentive here to do the right thing, if you will, in terms of what you actually expect to occur within the market will actually occur. So there are multiple pieces in place here that really, I think, prohibit this from occurring. I think at the time that this occurred 2.5 years ago, there was a learning curve for us. We didn't understand the consequences as well as the test was not visible to us, actually. And so that's why we did address this situation and put a process in place. I'm not aware of this issue in any other balancing areas or even that it's been an issue in our BAA since that time. So I'm not sure this is as big of an issue maybe as, Clay, you're referring to, but again, I don't have that context that you had.
Heather and then Tony.
And Kelsey is making a good point. I remember now 2.5 years ago it was a big negative economic impact on entity. So entity is not benefiting from this. It doesn't look like people on the other side are losing. So they are motivated to modify this as soon as they can. Now in your situation, I think it's more than a year that we have all the settlement information for participants. and we are working for settlement information for non-participants in the spring release. So I don't understand your concerns. Are you talking about problems you still have? Is something missing? And the last point, you're talking about mitigation. These are not negative decremental bids. These are protection on sales schedules, on base schedules. These are penalty protection to avoid curtailment of base schedules. So if you start talking about that, we'll start talking about we need to mitigate load bids, and we don't have load bids yet in EIM. So there is no mitigation right now of protected base schedule or sales schedules.
So you can submit a base schedule of 100 megawatts with a bid offer curve that reduces your generation. And that's what we're concerned about, is that if you have an offer to reduce your base schedule or to reduce your generation from 100 megawatts down to 0, and you'll do that for $150 a megawatt hour, that can become predatory.
And I would point out, it's not the fact that it's not, you don't do this by bidding negative 150. If you put in a base schedule and it's non-participating, then we would curtail that self-schedule at a higher penalty price than even the $150. And so we're trying to, and we want to maintain that scheduling priority to the extent we can, because they've said I don't want to be redispatched within the market. So you're sort of changing, you're moving people that were sort of in the non-participating role and moving them into the participating role. And I think that's another reason why we're giving that feedback back to the EIM entity, because if someone's non-participating, it's going to be the balancing authority area that should move that resource, not the market operator.
But in the example here, generator 1 is a participating resource with a bid curve that goes down to 0, negative $150 a megawatt hour. So I don't understand I don't understand why you're saying that I'm bringing into scope non-participating resources by that example. And then I just want to real quick go back to Chelsea's comment that yes, that we have seen this not just in one BA but multiple BAs, and we have had other entities contact us as well with respect to this. And so it's not isolated. It's not an isolated event. I will give big kudos to Pacificor that they have addressed this has done a great job of we have not seen this since I think they've put these protections in place.
Tony?
Thanks, Pam. Don, thinking forward to EDM, help me orient my brain on how the deliverability aspect of a ISO's RA program and what might or be put in place external might be aligned so that we can, it sounds like deliverability sounds like a good thing to me to ensure the resources can actually perform on their obligations. What can we think about as far as putting things in better alignment?
So it's actually not a resource adequacy issue. The key is in the day-ahead time frame, you're starting from 0. So you don't have a base schedule or a settlement difference. The reason this uplift occurs is because you've dispatched up a higher priced resource and a generator down. In the EDAM construct, you wouldn't even have any settlement that did that because you've never scheduled them that way.
I'm thinking more about the application of the test rather than the financial implications of the movement and the settlement. But the way the ISO works is I've always understood it, right? There's a deliverability test for the resources that count for RA. I would assume, and again I'm thinking out loud, that there would be alignment between the RA rules and the RS rules such that you'd have that same deliverability type analysis to make sure the resources could perform. And then is there an analog in the OAT world also where, because I don't, it's one of these challenges that Californians are going to have to deal with here. We haven't actually looked at an OAT tariff in 20 years. You wouldn't have the rights, right, in a contract path world to flow something beyond the capabilities of the system and call it a load-serving resource. So it seems like there should be conceptual alignment of the systems.
So I think from a RA or an integrated resource program planning and your transmission planning process, you are you should be looking at that to make sure that you know that you can serve your load with the generation you have and the transmission system you have. But I do think that the moving to the EDAM does help address that, because rather than having to have everybody scheduling on a contract path basis, you're actually going to come up with day-ahead schedules that we know are feasible to the physical system that we're dispatching or scheduling. So we will have taken a crack in the day-ahead time frame where we've set up all of the base schedules that are they're all going to be transmission feasible. People will have, there'll be some mechanism to distribute the congestion rents that recur from doing that process. And so then when you go into the real-time market now, the only thing that would be driving real-time congestion offset is changes in the system conditions that weren't known when we did the day-ahead market. So that's the whole point, is if you know this information and you can set yourself up correctly, then you're not going to have this issue occur.
And we agree with that. And I think he said congestion revenue rents. If congestion revenue rents are in the day-ahead market, are available, then you also have an opportunity to hedge yourself against that. Then going back to the question, Teresa's question and Putter's question, that is this still happening? Is this broadly occurring? That's why our request for transparency on the last page exists. We want to know, yes or no, did it pass for each interval, for each test? So there's 4 tests, each interval, 1 or 0, and then we can look at if the neutrality charges are available too for that EIM entity. You can correlate the two and say whether or not this problem exists. And so that's all we're asking for. And we're load-serving entities that are being allocated these neutrality charges, and we feel like that's an important part of transparency in the market, is to be able to see whether these tests are being passed. By the way, we do not think that this is something that you really – we're looking for protection from this, from the market operator and the EIM entity, but they are not the entities that are causing the problem. We want to make that clear. They are not the entities that are the source of the problem, but we think that they can help us address it. You know, it's like if we see the EIM entities as the golf course owners, and we see the market operator as the golf course operator. But we don't really have an issue with them. It's the people that are golfing on the course and teeing off on the greens and driving their carts all over the greens. And that's the issue, and we want some protection from that, so that it's the playing field is protected.
Therese? There are too many people in between me. So I just wanted to make sure I heard, Therese Hampton, Public Generating Pool, clarify a couple of things. So I think what I heard Kelsey say is there is an impact or a consequence. If it's not deliverable, it doesn't count towards the other tests. So that's helpful to understand, is there is an impact there. And then the second thing, I just want to follow up, Don, a little bit in this thought about deliverability and EDAM, which I know there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen there, but there isn't, I think what I heard Petter say is if it's not deliverable in EIM, you don't cut the schedule, it's not your responsibility. But if we're in EDAM and there's a feasibility or a deliverability test, that schedule or that operation can't be accepted. Will there be some lack of acceptance?
Someone could come in and self-schedule that generator into day-ahead time frame, which just means that we would accept that schedule unless there is congestion, at which point we would then curtail it to a schedule that was feasible at penalty prices that exceed the lowest economic bid. Yes, so it still can happen, but we're not going to. You won't get the financial impact of it because we aren't going to actually create a base schedule that has it. That means that we then need to resolve later. We're just not going to let it happen in the first place.
Okay. That was, I think, the piece I wanted to understand is you're not going to let that happen in the first place so that you're not setting up to resolve it.
So when we run day ahead, we'll have visible schedules, okay, and then we have awards for day ahead, and you enter real time and you say, I don't want to have any bid beyond the ahead sales schedule, and you self-schedule that resource. And then situation, real-time changes here, outage, transmission outage, whatever, and that schedule is still going to be infeasible for some transmission. So it may happen in much less scenarios than today when everybody does their base schedules. People do it differently. Some are doing transmission feasible, some are not doing transmission feasible. So it may happen, but in much less number of scenarios it's going to happen. And it's going to be dealt with for the protection we have in real time for the ahead sales schedules.
Tony had a question?
No.
Any other questions from the audience? I had a more, I think, generic question, since I have Dawn here to ask all my resource adequacy questions of, where I can't seem to suss them out from the CPUC proceedings. So I understand, so from PGE's perspective, we generally do resource adequacy planning on a seasonal or a seasonal peak basis, and I understand the ISO does that more on a monthly basis, and then once you've identified kind of the monthly showing, then there's a must-offer obligation for every hour within that month. Can you kind of talk through some of that process?
So we do have an annual showing to where we look at sort of the summer peak months and make sure to see how that is. And then we have a monthly showing where all of the LFCs show the resources that they have available for RA. They do come with a must-offer obligation to bid into the day ahead, and some of them have must-offer obligations to bid into the real-time market. And then to the extent that they make those showings and we see that we're insufficient for the month, we have backstop procurement rules where we can go then contract with supply to make up for that shortfall, and then we allocate that cost back to the load-serving entities that were identified as being. And that's on a month-ahead basis. That's why I always, when you think about resource adequacy, you're really thinking that forward contracting, the making sure that you've contracted with enough steel on the ground that you're going to be able to reliably manage your system.
And so then the showing is it for the month peak hour, or is it for?
They show all of their resources, and then we see how they stack up against the peak load forecast. But again, we have a system requirement, we have a local requirement, and then we have a flexibility requirement.
Thank you. And Tant, maybe I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the different considerations that we as a EIM entity have had from setting ourselves up kind of just for our own operations versus kind of looking at how we position ourselves specifically to meet the resource efficiency test, and if there's any differences in operations kind of before or after our EIM participation, how that has aligned with the structure and the flexibility of the test.
Well, having the resource efficiency rules and, not being able to participate in the market, it makes you more attuned, because there's no penalty cost. The penalty is not being able to be in it. So in the past, let's say you set yourself up, including the flexibility, and then if you fall short, you can, pick up the phone and call somebody, even if it is for 15-minute schedule. We don't want to do it, but there will be a market, even if it's bilag, it has to happen quick. You can do all of that. But with the EIM, there isn't that per se option. There is, but nobody's going to trade with you because all of your, the majority of the entities are already in the market. So that's why you have to be like T-minus 75. You really need to know where you're going to be and how much flexibility you need. Before. In the past, you had up to T-minus 20. So that's the difference.
And I think this is why, if you look at the EDAM issue paper, one of the things we talked about was, is there a need for the ability to now transact bid range to pass these tests? And that would be both in the day ahead and the real-time time frame where you would do that so that you could have those short-term movement of bid range and how you would track that.
Are you thinking about some of the differences between the ISO's existing RA program and the way some of the RA programs work in the different states, and how those may or may not align from the EDAM perspective, and how that showing relates?
I mean, I think that comes into that'll come up into the rules in terms of how what resource for what BA do you allow to count for which BA's resource efficiency test in the day-ahead market time frame. And so I think then you step back from that, then the RA rules, once you know that, then whatever resource adequacy or integrated resource plan approach you take, then you would make sure that you've set that up so that you've got sufficient resources that you know you would be able to pass that day-ahead test.
I want to take a moment to see if there are any questions on the phone.
Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. And at this time, there are no questions on the phone.
John, and then we'll do Matt.
John Prescott with the EIM governing body. Just an observation. I think I finally get the difference between RA and RS now, so thanks. Appreciate that. But also on what Clay has been presenting, it took me a while to understand what the problem was, and Clay was kind enough to sit down with me a few months ago and explain it to where I get it. What I want to comment on is the fact that this is exactly what this RIF, this organization, is supposed to do, is to take an identified issue, and then you can have a lively debate, which we had on it today, which really helps inform me on the governing body as to what action should be taken. Once I understood this issue, I did take it to the ISO, and it's been discussed there. But this is an excellent forum to where this and other issues can be discussed. And as long as we're not a quorum, and my colleague Carl is here as well, it's important for us to attend and hear that discussion. So just a big kudos for this discussion. It was great for me.
And Matt?
So I'll do this as a two-parter. One is a follow-up for Don. So as you think about, the year-ahead and month-ahead showings that Pam was asking about for California RA entities in the current BAA, CAISO BAA, you're able to take those showings and validate them as providing sufficient steel in the ground, as you put it, although, it could be sufficient water behind the dam, so it's a bunch of different resources, or sufficient sunshine expected to come out of the sky, because based on those fairly minimal showings, right, we're just showing megawatts by resource, without delving into all of the terms and conditions in each of those contracts, because the California RA product has some standardization. It has a must-offer obligation, right, that has all been vetted prior. Well, so where I was going with that is when we get into the EDAM discussion, how do you envision, so you'll have showings of some kind for resources that have contracts of some kind without your delving into every line of those contracts. What is the kind of equivalent standardized product that you would look for that provides the level of firmness such that both the reliability, the availability, the capacity, the feasibility, all of those characteristics you're trying to establish can be, sort of validated with a simple test. So do you have a vision of that, or is that the whole ball of wax?
I think you've discussed the issue paper rather well on what the resource efficiency framework you're going to have to come up with in a day-ahead time frame is. And like I said, when I think about it, what's going to be unique is really having, since people contract with resources outside their balancing authority area, there's all of that, that there's going to be a new level of sort of tracking, as I said, where which BAA is tied to which resource for meeting the load in that BAA, and
in what time period forward.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So the second part I was going to point towards Tyann, which sort of follows up on your question, Pam. Have you taken any different approach, and you don't have to get into specifics, but in contracting that you do now, knowing that you will have to meet these EIM tests? So, you know, once you put the bogey out there and say, here's a test that your portfolio is going to have to meet every interval, you know, 6 months from now, a year from now, does your long-term contracting now look for different characteristics, different requirements on the generator or the producer of electrons to meet those tests when you get to them?
Let's see, there are 4 tests that the market does. The main ones we look at is, you know, can it be there as available, does it have transmission? We always have done that. We also look at flexibility, because we look at flexibility is going to be important, biddable contracts important. So we look at much broader parameters now than we used to do. Just, you know, I need to meet my, you know, peak load. And that flexibility piece is going to be what we look at a little bit in a broader way than anything else. Contracts, to see if we can get those.
So, and that's a great answer, and I think, you know, it's worth thinking about in the EDAM context that there is this feedback loop, right? So the rules that you set up, you know, in the day ahead, even though it's a very short run forward time frame, will dictate how resources that you contract with 10 years ahead of time get counted, get assessed, whether they deliver the value that you thought they were going to deliver once they show up as resource sufficiency, you know, whatever that means in an EDAM context. So all of us as, you know, participants in this market, you know, yes, we have our state jurisdictional resource planning framework that might look different in one state than another, but at the end of the day, they all have to deliver resources that do what we think they're supposed to do when they get to that real or day-ahead time frame.
Any other comments or questions from the audience? Well, let's thank our panelists for a lively discussion. And we will have a break, and we will reconvene at 3:45.